Production and distribution of City Club forums on IdeaStream are made possible by the generous support of PNC and the Raskin Family Fund, with additional funding from Robert Conrad, Cleveland State University, the Chautauqua Institution, the Cleveland Clinic, and the United Black Fund of Greater Cleveland, Incorporated.
Good afternoon. Welcome to the City Club of Cleveland. I'm John Schubert, and today we're at the Tincomville Center at Case Western Reserve University for a special forum on the role of the media in helping the community understand the state of Cleveland's children. And we're doing it in honor of the 20th anniversary of the Schubert Center for Child Studies. Over the last several years, the percentage of Cleveland's children living in poverty has increased steadily, topping out at 52% in a report released late last year. The barriers faced by these children and their families are enormous, especially for those whose poverty spans multiple generations, affecting their ability to lead rewarding lives and preventing the region from thriving. The environment for children in Cleveland is fraught with inequities and disparities, beginning with infant mortality and spanning disparities in academic performance, school expulsion, health outcomes, and involvement with the juvenile justice system. While many state and local organizations have put forth concerted efforts to assist children, it's often not enough. Recently, print and television media have prioritized stories about the plight of poor children and urged the community to collaborate to take action. Will it work? What other efforts can and should the media take to work with researchers, policymakers, and programs to help children out of poverty? We've assembled a group of local journalists to discuss these issues. Here to steward the conversation is high school senior and City Club Youth Forum Council Chair, Teolu Orsanya. In her role at the City Club, Ms. Orsanya leads a team of high school students in creating forums on a myriad of topics relevant to today's youth. Under her leadership, the Youth Council's membership doubled in size. She will begin college this fall and plans to major in accounting. Teolu, I turn the forum over to you to introduce our panelists.
Thank you for that wonderful introduction. It's an honor to moderate this panel on the 20th anniversary of the Schubert Center. And from what I've heard, it's been a great day so far. But I do have to warn you, it only gets better from here. I hope that by the end of this, that we'll all have a better grasp of the media's role in advocating for equity for Cleveland's children. And today we have three panelists. First, we have Layla Atassi, reporter for Cleveland.com. She's been reporting in Cleveland for almost 15 years, covering a variety of issues for Cleveland.com and The Plain Dealer. Currently, she's working on a project called A Greater Cleveland, focused on the challenges children face growing up in poverty. Very relevant to today's discussion, by the way. Our next panelist, Margaret Bernstein, is the Director of Advocacy and Community Initiatives for WKYC. She won an Emmy 2 years ago for her #WeReadHere campaign, which encouraged parents to read with their children. Margaret has also co-authored a memoir on fatherlessness. And finally, Rachel DeSalle, a reporter for The Plain Dealer, has written several investigative pieces on a myriad of issues. Her stories have also led to visible changes in the community, such as her series with Layla that led to the testing of 14,000 rape kits. She's also an adjunct professor at Kent State University. So as seen through your work, you've all had significant impact on the Cleveland community and its children. So we'll start local with the series The Plain Dealer did a couple summers ago called Pathways to Peace, a series focused on youth violence. Rachel, could you give us a little behind-the-scenes look into what stories were covered and the thinking behind choosing each story?
Sure. It was so long ago, and we're doing so many different things now. I have to think back. I think that, like many people in Cleveland, we were kind of grappling with what we saw was kind of an uptick in violence, and really wanted to bring the focus onto solutions. You know, what was being done elsewhere in the country that could be useful here, and how could we tell those stories as a way to spur that conversation. So we told stories about police training that was helping police and young people start to understand each other a little bit better. One of my colleagues, John Caniglia, told another story about different ways for police to intervene. And I have to say, though, and Layla also did a story about Cure Violence, which was another initiative that was being tried other places. And I think for us, that was just a way to start a conversation in a different place. But looking back now, you know, and in media time, when we wrote that series, it's a long time ago, I think there was something very vital missing from that series, and that was really true youth voice. I think that we've spent a long time in these careers being taught to be the person who has the lens, be the person who writes the story. And more recently, I've been thinking a lot about how we need to kind of hand over the microphone, the notebook, and the pen, and let young people tell us what things we should be paying attention to, and let people tell some of their own stories so that they're authentic, and that we need to spend time listening to them, and then work on doing our job alongside them.
Layla, do you have any input on the series and what the Plain Dealer did at that time?
I agree. Is my mic on?
Yeah.
Okay. I agree with Rachel. You know, we were kind of contemporaneously working on a series of stories that were looking at the whole menu of programming that's available nationwide, the best practices across the country. And as Rachel mentioned, I went to Baltimore and looked at the program that they had there that was based on the Cure Violence model, and then Cure Violence, came to Cleveland to speak with the Peacemakers, the Cleveland Peacemakers Alliance, and to see what parts of their programming could be applied here in Cleveland. But I agree with Rachel in the sense that both of our stories, while I felt we were effective at sort of, informing the community of what else was going on in the country, we both kind of missed it as far as how would any of these programs actually affect youth on the ground here in Cleveland and in the neighborhoods. And then we both really pivoted toward starting that conversation in our newsrooms and launching projects that give voice to actual families, actual children who are living the daily challenges every day.
Margaret, you've had years of experience in this arena, so could you give us a little insight into what WKYC is doing to advocate for equity in this area?
That's such a great question, and I want to start out by saying that I was a fellow coworker with these two, and it was my honor because they are fierce advocates, and I think we all work together to try and figure out where do we leave behind that training we received in journalism school and actually use the media outlet for good. How do we take that power of the media and give voice and also create change? And so I deeply admire what they've done, and I just want to say that 25 years of working at the Plain Dealer taught me that the best way to advocate to get a child out of poverty is to make sure that they are literate, to make sure that they read at grade level. We looked at a lot of things, and everybody, I think, took a different path, and I just decided that was going to be my path. And that's what actually led me to volunteer to be laid off from the Plain Dealer, as I decided if you're going to go all out for literacy, the place that you don't do that is in the pages of a newspaper, right? You need to take that crusade elsewhere. And so I'm very blessed to be brought on board at Channel 3, where I am the Director of Community Relations. Also blessed to have a general manager who basically says, Margaret, if you can dream it, we will let you do it. And so we've had a lot of fun designing campaigns in Cleveland that try and transform households. I really believe that if we want to make kids literate, we got to transform that household where they live and make it a reading-friendly environment. And that's a challenge when those parents probably were not confident readers themselves and may have led them to drop out of school. So I'm really trying, as I do this work, to design campaigns that reward and incentivize parents for reading with their kids and for having books in the home. Our last campaign was called Slavic Village Reads, and I've indulged my newspaper side. I actually, knowing that we don't have time for me to talk to you about how great this campaign was, I actually wrote up an old newspaper-style story about what we accomplished in a year in Slavic Village. Come and get a copy. And I want to thank Third Federal, a wonderful sponsor that's helped me create commercials and news story, and provided a great commercial series for us that really spotlighted parents reading with their children in Slavic Village. And that, I believe, has had an incredible ripple effect and encouraged parents to understand, you know, you could get on TV if you read with your child, and that's the power. I believe people want to be on television, and I honestly feel like I can use that to advantage to incentivize parents to want to read with their kids. So, short version of a great program.
All right. So, Margaret, in promoting racial and gender equity, a common and in some ways successful solution has been to bring those voices that are not so common into those arenas. So do you see bringing more young people, more teenagers, more children into the TV stations, the newspapers, the Cleveland.coms to actually write these stories as a potential solution?
I feel like we're all making strides to do that better. So I'm glad to see that we've reached the point where we understand we need to let young people speak in their words. It also doesn't hurt that we need a younger audience for our media, right? We need a younger audience. You know, there's not a lot of young people that want to read a paper, and to be honest, they do not turn on their television at 6 o'clock to watch the news anymore. So it benefits us as well as them to let them tell their stories. Right before the March for Our Lives, Channel 3 invited 5 fantastic students in, and we live streamed a conversation with them similar to this about what they were doing at their schools and why they felt this was a turning point. And this is. I don't think we can miss the fact that young people are feeling empowered, and we need to make sure that we cover that not from our perspective, but also from theirs.
And let's be clear, I mean, representation is a problem. You know, the media likes to point out everybody else's failures, but our failure is that our newsrooms are mostly white and mostly people from the suburbs. And we do not reflect our community, and that's something that every single organization in town that's kind of considered mainstream media needs to do better at. And you know, I'm all about putting young voices in the paper, and we're going to do that. You know, we have some stories running over the next 3 days where I started out following IJ's Impact 25 Youth Council, and I was all set to write stories about it. And then I realized, you know, I think I need to let them tell their story about what they're doing. And so we worked with 4 or 5 of the members, and the stories that are going to appear in the paper are the ones that they wrote about their process. And I'm proud of that, and I'm glad that they did that, but that is not a substitute for nurturing people and nurturing kids in Cleveland to grow up and do these jobs, so that we're not substituting, you know, their words as young people for them being in these careers and having a stake in newsrooms and at television stations.
So it goes without saying that trust in the media of all forms has gone down a lot in recent years, and that is also translates to young people. So I want to ask you, Layla, how do you restore that trust so that young people aren't just consuming media, but are also willing to participate and be part of that process?
That's an excellent question. Oh boy, restoring trust among young people. I mean, really, the point of the project that we have launched has been to bring, I mean, twofold really, to bring the stories of everyday challenges that face the families of Cleveland, to bring those so closely, to make them so personal and so intimate to readers in Cleveland that you cannot look away. And I feel like we have created a following with our, you know, sort of daily and weekly coverage of that has been really larger than life. I never expected that it would catch fire in this way. And I feel like just with, you know, in that reporting model, we have just stayed as true as we can to the experiences of the people that we're covering. And, you know, that kind of shoe leather reporting, I'm not sure how else but to tell the true stories of the families that are living it every day, and for them, you know, to, you know, I guess I should say this. I know that our following might not be stronger anywhere in the Cleveland area than it is in the neighborhoods where we've been writing the stories. I know that so many of the families in King Kennedy and in Garden Valley read our stories and talk about it among themselves. And I feel like if that for the first time in a long time, they feel that they have a voice and that someone is listening. That has gone, in my opinion, so far toward restoring faith in media, at least among the neighborhoods and people living in them in Cleveland.
Margaret, would you like
Well, I could just agree. As I've mentioned, I've tried to embed literacy programming that's sponsored by the station in neighborhoods. We've launched Slavic Village Reads last year, and now we're launching Huff, and we're going to Central next. And very much the message, we have a monthly literacy event that we always cover, that I hear being said is, thank you for coming for something that wasn't negative. And the fact that I'm even creating this program by saying we're going to be here every month covering your literacy activities creates that trust, because now it's a relationship. It's not a parachute in, do the story, which they may or may not appreciate or may or may not have seen all sides, and then depart. Now it's a relationship, and for better or worse, it's a conversation, a two-way conversation.
Yeah, I agree with that completely. I think that has become, especially as newsroom resources dwindle through the years, and you see the reporting staff, bare bones every single year, getting slimmer and slimmer. Our resources are kind of allocated toward, for the most part, parachuting in when there is a shooting, knocking on the door of the victim's mother, talking for a few minutes, writing that story, and moving on to the next thing. And this is a completely different kind of relationship building experience that all three of us have been involved in.
So in terms of Cleveland, as John mentioned, Cleveland's youth face a myriad of problems that can be traced back to poverty in many ways. So what are practical ways and what can the media actually do in terms of maybe driving change, whether politically or in terms of public opinion, to actually alleviate some of the issues that children in Cleveland are facing?
Well, I think our main mission, always, at least mine, is to kind of question authority and bring those facts to the forefront. As I've done some of this reporting and talking to young people, sitting in classrooms, what's important to them, Layla brought up a good point. We kind of polled like 70 ninth graders, and the fact that they all felt kind of labeled and perceived based on what was covered in the media, that every time, a headline said shooting on the east side, they felt like that reflected upon all of them, and the stress that caused, and trying to figure out how do we kind of push back on that by making the simple choice to do some stories that are in depth about the other side of that, the young people that are really doing amazing things and get no attention for it. Not in a way that's fluffy, but in a way that's really reflects their realities. I think we can do that as well. And the other thing that's hard, and I think this is kind of the point we might be at, I can't speak for Layla, but the point we're at now is that you do a lot of storytelling around what people's stories are and letting their voices be heard, but then how do you connect that? How do you connect that with social change and action? Because if you stop at that point where you let people's voices be heard and you don't push it beyond that and connect it to policy and politics and structural change and government and decision making, then you've told a story, but you haven't really finished the job. And I think that's the point where we're at now. We have to figure out how to connect what people are hearing about the families that Layla's writing about, what people hear from young people, to what actually needs to be done to fix that. That's the only way you're going to create a push for it in the community.
Right. So Margaret, in TV news, it's a little different than like print media and online media. So could you explain a little more about what you think that stations like WKYC can do to actually affect change?
Well, news coverage, and know that I don't come out of the news department, but by all means, I've always, anywhere I work, advocate for just balanced coverage. You've got a story, that is talking about, a criminal act by teenagers. I think you also have to go that far to find the story about teenagers who are not criminals. You've got to balance that coverage out. But in my role as the community relations director at the station, I'm always trying to find new ways that our station can just interact in a meaningful way with high school students. There's a Cleveland High School, CMSD High School right across the street from our station, Cleveland High School for Digital Arts. Now here those kids are right across the street, literally, learning skills that are, are preparing them for careers in media. So I am smashing our two entities together as much as I can. A month ago, we took our employees across the street for lunch to interact with those kids, because those kids have a lot to say. So there's relationship happening there. Right. So that's what I just continue to do in my role, is try and carve out ways, because now I've got news department interacting with real live Cleveland kids, right? They were there the whole time. Who knows what that could result in terms of those kids creating media that reflects their interests.
I just wanted to jump in too and say that, so this, we in our project, A Greater Cleveland, we've spent the first, since August, kind of telling the stories and developing the empathy among readers, and now we're kind of pivoting toward taking a deeper look at some of the issues that have risen to the surface for us. And also, I want to give a shout out to Amber Donovan and her Open Table initiative that is just catching fire throughout Northeast Ohio. And we have lots of coverage online about that if you want to check it out and look more closely, but we are partnering with them. But some of the issues that have come up time and again in our reporting that we would like to look more closely at are things like, education inequities. I've spent some time getting to know children who go to Anton Gardena on the east side, and the illiteracy there is staggering. The school is perennially failing. It is a vexing problem for Cleveland schools. We have spent some time talking to the administration about that, and we understand it is complicated, but we want to get into what makes it complicated, and then also things like how could trauma-informed care and trauma-informed classrooms play a role in solutions for schools like Anton, and how can it be scaled up so that even though there are many children who need that sort of attention, that they can all receive it. I know, again, scarcity of resources is a big issue. Beyond that, housing is such a big issue among the families that we've gotten to know. So many families on the waiting list, waiting years and years to get into public housing, which is the worst conditions in some cases. And in the meantime, rolling the dice on the private housing market and finding landlords who are awful in some cases. And that, I don't want to obviously disparage all landlords. That's certainly not true. But if you've read the book Evicted, you know what they're up against and how an eviction can spiral a family out of control. One of the families we're writing about now is faced with an eviction, and all the things that were laid bare in that book are coming to pass for her. And you'll probably read more about that moving forward in the next couple months here. But things like, I met a woman recently who said, she said that she was feeling very blessed because she finally got her housing voucher, and she had waited 10 years for it. And she had spent, a couple of years in King Kennedy with her daughter, and they were about to move into a house that they were really excited about. And God knows what her experience was like before getting to King Kennedy, how long it took her to get to that point. So I feel, there are landlords who reject housing vouchers, limiting where families can go. All of these issues, I feel, will now, as Rachel said, it's important to tell the story, to kind of hook the reader, to get readers who might never think about families living in poverty to start thinking differently. But then once you do, what next? You have to kind of then set the table with the policy agenda moving forward. So that's sort of what we're all faced with.
All right, so we have time for a quick final question. But first I want to ask a question of the audience. So by a show of hands, how many of you on a weekly basis, let's say, consume either newspaper media or Cleveland.com or TV channel news? Okay, close to 100%. How many of you see your children read a newspaper on a weekly basis? 6 people. Or how many see your children consume any kind of news on a weekly basis? 10% of the room. And then how many of you see your children consume some sort of social media on a daily basis? Okay. All right. So my final question to all of you, news media is not the only kind of media out there. Kids are on social media, there's video games. What role do those other forms of media play in actually advocating equity or influencing these children in the future? Rachel, do you want to start?
So, and by other forms of media, do you mean all the different social media?
Yeah.
I mean, I think they do provide an opportunity for anybody to be heard. So, I mean, recently I was in Chicago and I was doing a training for a group called Chicago Survivors. And there are families that have survived the death of a loved one. And they were talking about how, the media in Chicago didn't hear the stories they wanted to tell. And they were very frustrated by this. And they wanted me to come in and tell them how to get the media to tell those stories. And my response to them was, I can share some strategies with you, but I don't know that you need the media to tell those stories. I think you can tell them on your own. You guys have a Facebook page, you have a Twitter account, you have Instagram. You respond to these families right after a homicide happens. You know the stories. They know the stories. You just need to think about it and then do it. And if you start telling your own stories, other people will follow. Now, is that what I want? I mean, I don't want that to replace the media because I think that you do need depth and you do need fact gathering and stuff like that. But the part that we've talked about is the personal part of it. I think people can do that, and I think young people can do that, and I encourage them to do that. We find stuff from that. We think of things that we might not have otherwise thought of because maybe this wasn't my experience, and I see someone else talking about their experience on social media. It's something that I knew that I didn't know. I think there's also, a lot of care that needs to be taken because as we all know, not everything you see on social media is true. So I'm always going to default to the fact that you have to be very careful about what you consume and careful about what your kids consume and careful about what you tell kids to consume. But at the same time, you have to allow that in and you have to make that an option for people who are not being heard, especially in mainstream media.
Layla, or Margaret?
I'm just thinking that everything that is occurring as a result of that Parkland shooting is unfolding mainly on Twitter. And so those students are Twitter powerhouses. Those young people that they put on the stage during the march are on Twitter. And so that's become the centerpiece of the conversation, I think, for young people who are getting involved in this anti-gun movement. But it's also a place for very polarizing speech. There's just a lot going on, so I think everyone needs to monitor it, but I do think it's an opportunity for young people to get involved in and also to learn to make their own decisions. But it's certainly become, I think, the most important way of purveying news to young people is on social media.
Layla, do you want to address?
I think, I think since for the past 5-6 years, we've been investing a lot of resources in trying to use social media to pump our content out to the masses. But then there's this, this conundrum of how do we use social media to bring the voices of young people who are, as you said, kind of leading in on those platforms? How do we bring that to our reporting and then create a product that that they want to consume? That I think is, that's the challenge that we face now in media. But yeah, it deserves a lot of thought and innovation.
All right, with that, we'll move to our audience participation portion. I'm Tiolu Orasanya, the chair of the City Club of Cleveland's Youth Forum Council, and we are here today at the Tinkham-Veal Center at Case Western Reserve University for a forum on the role the media plays in helping the community understand the state of Cleveland's children in honor of the 20th anniversary of the Schubert Center for Child Studies. Our panelists today are Layla Atassi, reporter for Cleveland.com, Margaret Bernstein, Director of Advocacy and Community Initiatives at WKYC, and Rachel DeSalle, reporter for The Plain Dealer. We're about to begin the audience Q&A. We welcome questions from everyone, City Club members, guests, students, or those of you joining us via radio, broadcast, or webcast. If you have a question, please make sure you make your way to one of the microphone stands. There's one over here and one over there. If you'd like to tweet a question, please tweet it at the City Club, and our staff will try to work it into the program. May we have our first question, please?
Good afternoon. Thank you for this very important forum. Layla, I'm so glad to be able to ask you this question. In the Greater Cleveland series, how did you make a decision between the stories being embarrassing to the families, reinforcing stereotypes from people out there who don't care to get to really know folks, and being important information? The story that comes to mind is the story you did with the roaches. And when I read that, I was like, oh my God, first of all, I wouldn't want anybody to know that I had all these roaches in my house. And secondly, I was like, people who read this are going to think that's what families have. They have plenty of roaches. So I guess, how did you determine whether it's going to be embarrassing or really important information or reinforce stereotypes?
Well, we, from day one of the project, before we even met and connected with the families, our number one guideline was first do no harm, and we empowered all of the parents who we worked with to make all of the decisions about, and this is kind of entering a different realm of journalism for us, because we set this project up, number one, to be about advocacy. We wanted to advocate for the families who have agreed to be a part of this, to advocate for, creating a community conversation, for connecting people to families in a way that has never, really been done. And so we told all the families when they signed up to be a part of this that we would never embarrass them. I've had so many, that family in particular, very dear friends of mine, who I've had lots of conversations with her about topics that will never see print, because I know, even without having to have the conversation with her, that is a personal, that's personal, and that she was sharing with me on the level of friendship, not on the level of, and it's tricky, because you position yourself as a reporter, but you're also, over time, you become friends on this kind of reporting experience. With that issue, that mother, her home was meticulous. We tried to describe this in the story, that she and her children took very good care of their apartment. They shared walls with units that were not as clean, and that is a truth about life in public housing. And she wanted that story told, and it was a major point that she was making in her application to Habitat for Humanity, was that her living situation was just so unhygienic and unlivable because of things that were outside of her control. And so I put a lot of care into making sure that in that story we said, pretty clearly that this roach problem was outside of her control. They did what they could to control it, and she was happy with how that turned out. She has never taken issue with any of the stories we've written. She's never felt like stereotypes were reinforced or anything like that. I don't think any of the families have ever lodged any concerns. I think also it helps that we use pseudonyms, and we didn't, we created, we gave we let the mothers actually choose the names for their families, or the kids played a role in that too often. And I think that gave them great comfort, because then they could speak quite freely and let us, have this access to their family that would otherwise be a little bit more closed off. And yeah, thanks for the question. Next question.
First, I want to say, Teola, you're terrific. And Ms. Bernstein, I miss you in the PD. My question goes to Ms. Atassi and to Ms. Dissel. I think Greater Cleveland is a really great series. What kind of criticism have you received from readers or reporters or anyone else about the series? Has there been any criticism which has caused you to change the way you reported or wrote subsequent articles?
I think probably the criticism that I take most seriously, I mean, the one that really I have been thinking quite a bit about, which Rachel brought up actually, is that sense of like, well, now what? I think, it's been talked about like, well, okay, well now, are we experiencing compassion fatigue from reading story upon story about the families over and over again? And then what do you do with all of that? And we had been, for the last couple months, talking about how do we pivot, what do we do next? And so I guess stay tuned. I hope that I can deliver on that sort of thing, and that we can dig into the issues that we talked about, housing and education, and exposure to violence and trauma and things like that are on the horizon for us. But that is probably the most key criticism that I have taken quite to heart.
Rachel, do you want to?
So, I mean, I haven't written any of those stories, but I think that one thing that I can say is anytime you spend a lot of time reporting on something, there's always going to be criticism of it. And I think that I can probably speak for all of us. Anytime we've done something with an expectation that we're doing it for a reason. And it's really hard when you don't see things change. I don't think there's any reporter that has reported on poverty or lead poisoning or sexual assault that then sees the slow progress of change and doesn't take that to heart. One of the other things that I think is hard is that you pour yourself into stories, whether it's about children or other things, and sometimes you don't see the communities step up and take on those issues in a certain way, and that's hard too. I do a lot of reporting now with Bree Zeltner, who is so invested in reporting on infant mortality, and we reported on lead poisoning starting in 2015. And the fact that I feel like we haven't made movement in those things as much as we thought we would, it just breaks our hearts. It really does. So I think the one thing that, there is that criticism. There will always be criticism. The media should be criticized just like we criticize everybody else, so go ahead. But we also struggle to say, how do we get the public to step up in these things? Because we can put out this information, but if people don't care enough about it to then start organizing around it, I don't really know what else we can do. And I think we've actually, without thinking about it, have started to pivot and move into that role where we don't see people filling, whether it's because they are in poverty and just don't have that extra ounce of energy to do it, or for whatever reason. And it's become kind of a sticky situation for us to figure out how do we handle that. And so, I mean, I actually have taken a step back and said, like Layla mentioned, I need to do more listening. And so, we followed along this youth council and then decided we actually needed to hear from more kids, and not just in an on the surface way, but also in like a really deep way. So we reached out, and everybody loves to collaborate. We're going to collaborate with a group of about 20 young people over the next month, and we're putting on a workshop. We're just going to work with them on all these issues and them talking about them and dig deeper. And they'll do fun stuff like produce music and take pictures, and those are the things they told us they want to do. But we also hope that's a really good opportunity to walk with them deeper into these issues as well.
I'd just like to add that I do think you've got a panel of very introspective reporters up here who do try and get better at what we do. And I'll give a great example of, as a plain dealer reporter myself, I would write about fatherlessness. I covered poverty a lot. But after I wrote the book that Tiolu referred to about missing dads, I learned so much, and particularly about the fact that at the root of the missing father crisis is the fact that this is generational. Those dads who are not stepping up had missing dads themselves. And so once I really got that strongly, I become a real crusader for things when I get my eyes open. I went and sold the news department on writing a story for the front page on Father's Day about profiling 3 men who didn't have fathers themselves, but were teaching themselves how to be dads. Okay, there we go. Now I'm trying to figure out how can I teach our reader that this isn't, just, oh, you absentee dads, you're the problem, but explaining why this happened. And then that package of stories also included information on programs. I think I saw Mukit in here somewhere. Okay, it included Mukit Sabir programs like his for missing dads, or for fathers that need to learn those skills and get a little confidence in the fact that they have everything they need to be a great dad. So that's the growth that I think we're all striving for, to get smarter every time we write.
Next question.
Let me preface this by saying there's no disrespect meant to any of our fine panelists, but I've been a very vocal advocate for our children and our youth since the day of the Chardon school shootings on February 26, 2012. The media has continued to play a huge role in perpetuating this coverage. A lot of false or misleading information has been publicized or broadcast, with retractions being given later. Stories have been sensationalized in the effort to gain ratings. And I'm asking you, number one, what standards do you hold yourself to? And what standards will you hold your colleagues to in the future in reporting stories such as this? Because the media, I believe, has an obligation to report those stories not only accurately, but sensitively. Thank you.
Can you be a little bit more clear what you're talking about? I think it would be hard for us to respond not knowing what stories you're talking about. Otherwise, all I could say is I think everyone here would say they'd hold themselves to the highest ethical standards. I don't know.
Is there a specific story that you have in mind that you feel the media mishandled?
I can't point to any direct instances, but if you research and follow coverage from everything from the Chardon school shootings to Sandy Hook to the recent events at Parkland, you'll see that stories have been printed or broadcast, and there have been later retractions that the information wasn't accurate. There are stories that have been sensationalized, and I believe if you do some investigation, you'll see what I'm talking about.
I think, I mean, in today's climate, it is, you know, everyone is racing for the story. That you do see that nationally, I think, among media. That I do recall, what was the shooting? Oh, it was the Boston bombing. That's the one that comes to mind when I think of misinformation. There was information spinning out of Twitter that ended up in print or online, and some of the national. I see what you're saying, and that is a slippery slope for a lot of media, I think, today, to kind of take a step back, verify information before you run with it, because you are, you know, yes, you are competing with more news outlets than ever before, but we all hold ourselves to the highest standard. And I'll speak for, you know, for my boss. I know he pumps the brakes all the time when we get things that we know others might have. If it doesn't pass the smell test, we will sit on it until we can nail it down. He always says, wait till you can get it right here. You know, don't just rush to judgment. So I feel like with those kind of steady hands and those gatekeepers at the helm, if we, I still have faith in my bosses and the people around me and my colleagues, but I do see what you mean. It does happen sometimes.
All right, next question.
Thank you so much. I feel like this room is so lucky to get to hear from some of the best reporters in Cleveland, and I often cheer when I see your bylines, so thanks so much. You know, on May 9th in Columbus, our legislators are going to have the last hearing for the next 2 years where they decide whether to give away more tax breaks to business interests. We give away $9 billion a year in tax breaks. Some of them are for good things, but a lot of them are a lot less important than dealing with lead, dealing with adequate class sizes, and they need to hear from you, they need to hear the kind of reporting you've done, and they need to hear from the experts in this room. So I guess my question is just, how can we connect the very valuable voices in this room, the incredible important resources that you bring, to the policies that are made in Columbus?
Well, speaking as an advocacy director for our station, I welcome a conversation with you and with anybody in this room. Appreciate what you've been listening to today and informing yourselves about, and that's something that a television station can do, as well as the editorial board for the Plain Dealer, Cleveland.com, is advocate. So we need to hear from you to find out what your concerns are. I'm available. I'll stick around.
I think that the sweet spot for us in that is, you know, you have on one hand where you can just cover legislation, what lawmakers are talking about. You have the other part where we've talked a lot about today is people's personal stories. It's really being able to connect those, really being able to have the person, the mother, the child, the family that is kind of the prism. You know, when I teach the students, it's like you have to have that example that helps you explain what that actually means. And so I think finding good ways to bring those together can be tricky, because you're talking about really big, complicated. I mean, when I think about my own taxes, I start to get nervous and shake. So when I think about everybody else's taxes, that's even harder. So trying to find a way to explain how tax breaks like filter down and affect individual families is something that we probably could do better with and probably have more reporting on for sure.
I think, what comes to piggybacking off that, when I think back to the Rape Kit Project, the most powerful parts of those stories were the actual voices of people who had been victimized and whose kit had been set aside for all those years. There's the numbers and then there are the people, and I think making policy personal is the way to make that connection, because we know now that on the state level there were major legislative changes that changed the rape kit conversation forever in Ohio. And I really hope that, I do believe in large part it was because we were able to make that personal for people, to show that there are real people affected by this, and justice deserved to be served. So, yeah.
If anybody wants to know how to go to Columbus and speak up about the resources and how they should be being sent, come see me.
Before we get to the next question, if the media is writing all the right stories, advocating for all the right things, how do all of you think you get those stories in front of the people that are actually making the changes, in front of the governors, the congressmen, the Senate, that kind of thing?
Those are probably the easiest people to reach. I mean, they are reading and digesting stories, I think, or at least they have people that work for them that are, and then telling them about it sometimes. But those people sometimes they make decisions based on people who give them money, but they in a greater sense, make decisions based on who votes for them and who, what the public demands. So I think having those stories in front of the public and having the public understand them is really what I'm always thinking about. So if I'm going to spend my time on writing something, I'm not thinking, I really hope that the governor reads this. I'm thinking, I really hope that enough people in my city read this, in my coverage area read this, that it resonates with them, that it matters to them, and they know what they think about it and what they care about, and if it's something worth them acting upon or not. So I don't maybe think about it as a politician type thing.
I want to also chime in about, I think years ago, our model used to be that we would work on a big investigative project, put it in a special package, and put it out on one day, and we'd spend months working on the special package to make it look so perfect in the paper. And then it would just, be a stone skipped across the pond, and that was it. It would sink to the bottom. And then we kind of developed over time the sense of developing the drumbeat, we called it. Over and over, you got to have the drumbeat, where it's one story, and then you compound it with the next one, and the next one, and you never stop. You just keep going. And that, I think, catches more attention, because public officials, when they want to turn a blind eye, they just, here comes the big special section, and then it's over, and then, all right, breathe a sigh of relief, or maybe some other big news breaks the next day and they can move on. But if you just keep harassing them with the story over and over again, then it's really hard to ignore.
Right. And calling them the easy answer, calling them for their comment.
Right. Put them on the record.
Exactly right.
That is so my MO, to the point where there's like a Cleveland.com commenter who, no matter what I write about, the first comment is paint chip lady. Like that's all, like, more paint chip stories. And that guy or lady, I don't know, probably thinks they annoy me, but I'm like, yes, that's what you think when you read my stories. And I think we found that, so when we started doing some of the lead poisoning reporting, I sat down and I talked to Bree Zeltner, who's a colleague, and she's like a health reporter, and she's talking about all the different health effects of this, and is spot on all of it. And I just kept coming back to the fact that we didn't discover this. And I went back in our archives, and I found something written 10 years earlier, and 10 years earlier than that, and 10 years earlier than that, and something from a 1950s paper that had really awful language about it. And that was when we were saying, okay, we can do our initial reporting, but then we need to keep going and going, right, and asking questions and being in the nitty-gritty areas that are hard to talk about, and writing so many stories that finally the people in power just throw up their hands and say, oh my gosh, we have to fix this, so they stop writing these stories.
Right.
It hasn't worked yet, so, but I'm hoping that we're getting closer to it than we ever were before, where we can say we've made a kind of a meaningful and lasting change.
Thank you for this really important conversation. conversation. My question is about capacity. At a time when there is limited capacity and increased financial pressures, there's increased just kind of this never-ending news cycle pressures, how do you keep attention on these really important but also very time-intensive issues? What internal and external factors help make sure that you're able to do what you do?
You never sleep? Ignore your children? I don't know. I don't have a good answer to that. I mean, it's nearly impossible. I mean, every time we lose another reporter in this town, every time the capacity of any of the media agencies shrink at all, it's a higher burden on all of us. And you know, I thought about that recently when writing about the police, and everyone keeps saying, oh, everyone's talking about how police are understaffed, how can they do this work? And you know, we like to point fingers, but I think about those detective bureaus, and I'm like, I know how they feel, because no matter how fewer people you have, the amount of stories that need to be told does not get less. You just have fewer people and harder choices to make. And so that happens for us, and it happens for so many other people doing important jobs in Cleveland. And I wish there was a good answer to it. Pay for media, buy a newspaper, go on cleveland.com, watch television, show your support for it, and then maybe we can get to a point where we can be adding more people to do this work rather than losing people to do this work.
I want to give credit also to our bosses because they value it. And I think that, in my newsroom, I know that there are a lot of reporters who, they're on beats that are really churning. And my boss could tell me, get to the churn. We need numbers, we need hits, we need page views, all that stuff that I know the pressure is on him from his bosses to get everybody in the churn. And he has carved out space for what he values as a journalist. And I know that's true for Rachel's newsroom too. And I feel like I just, am so grateful that we still have that space where we can, use our resources in that way.
I kind of interpreted your question as how does the average viewer or reader have capacity for all the news that's bombarding them, particularly in a news cycle where we've got a president tweeting and CNN is 24 hours and there's just a lot going on. And I do think we're all fighting that personally, right? How much is too much? Let's turn it off sometimes. All I can say is I personally have found my real comfort zone in the type of work I'm doing, where that's blending kind of community activism and kind of do-it-yourself call to action to the community. I think that's getting their attention. I think that's breaking through the overload and realizing here's the news media knocking on my door with something that I can actually take part in. I'm also executive producer of a show on Channel 3. It's called We the People, and it's not a community affairs show. I call it a community engagement show. And so I'm kind of taking these ideas, they know me, and that I'm kind of the person who never wrote a story without that box at the end that says, here's what you do. And that's my weapon for trying to cut through all of the deluge of news and get people to understand that they can be activists and take action.
Next question.
Hello, ladies. Thank you. You guys are all dynamic, and I follow you, all of you. Thank you so much for this opportunity. I just have one question. I'd like to know, and it's kind of going back to what Ms. Dissel said about how do we find a vehicle to give kids a voice so we can understand and learn more of how to fix things where we have failed, because we obviously know the problems. We keep going through the same things, having the same conversations. How can we listen to our kids? How can there be a forum there? I don't care what it is. How can we go to them and allow them to come to us to give them a voice so we know how to fix our problems with education?
I think that you just made me realize that not only do we need to listen to the kids, but we need to let them ideate their way out of the problem, right? What suggestions do they have? So I do think you've got a great arrangement where you have access to young people in your neighborhood to create something that allows them to speak on their issues. I once wrote a column for the Plain Dealer that was simply, tell me about a big problem in your neighborhood, and then tell me what you're going to do to solve it, and then I will write about you, right? So now that's giving people the agency to tackle things that seem hopeless and that create to a sense of hopelessness. So I mean that's an approach that I continue to take. I find that newsworthy when somebody tackles a problem in their neighborhood, and that's just kind of my approach to it.
City Club and at the Tinkham-Veal Center at Case Western Reserve University, we've been enjoying a very special forum in honor of the Schubert Center's 20th anniversary. Our panel conversation featured Leila Atassi, reporter for Cleveland.com, Margaret Bernstein, Director of Advocacy and Community Initiatives at WKYC, and Rachel DeSalle, reporter for The Plain Dealer. Our moderator was Tiolu Orisanya, who is the chair of the City Club Youth Forum Council. That brings us to the end of our program. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you all for being here. Panelists, thank you very much. Tiolu, thank you very much. Our forum is now adjourned.
For information on upcoming speakers or for podcasts of the City Club, go to cityclub.org.
Production and distribution of City Club forums on IdeaStream are made possible by the generous support of PNC and the Raskin Family Fund, with additional funding from Robert Conrad, Cleveland State University, the Chautauqua Institution, the Cleveland Clinic, and the United Black Fund of Greater Cleveland Incorporated.